And our last speaker is Miriam Moskowitz.
Go, Miriam.
All right, Miriam Moskowitz, who is.
It was a time of the toads. Screenwriter Dalton Trumbo said when he refused to testify before the McCarthy Committee, Un-American Committee, in 1947, he was one of the Hollywood 10 who were sent to prison rather than testify and name others as communists, which they would not do. When they were freed, they were blacklisted, some never to work at their craft again. At least 2 moved to England to pursue their careers elsewhere. The anti-communist fear was pervasive during the Truman-Eisenhower years. Despite that the Communist Party was a legal entity, it was a time of mounting hysteria in all walks of life, but particularly in the State Department, the armed forces, the teaching professions, the universities, the press, and in the ranks of science and entertainment. The purge paralyzed the unions and forced hundreds of workers out of jobs. Its repression machinery evolved into the loyalty boards, the loyalty oaths, the Attorney General's list, legislative committees of inquiries, the Smith Act prosecutions, the FBI and its paid informers, the deportation terror, the censorship of foreign mail, the restrictions on travel, and the participation by the press itself in the witch hunts. Into this maelstrom, the repressions found other victims, and I was one. In November 1950, I was convicted with co-defendant Abraham Brothman for conspiracy to obstruct justice. Brothman was a chemical engineer, and I was his secretary. The heart of the accusation was that Brothman and Harry Gold, who was employed by Brothman 2 years earlier, agreed to lie in their forthcoming appearance in May 1947 before a grand jury that was investigating Soviet espionage, and, said the indictment, I knew they would lie. Gold, known to the government as a perjurer and a fantasist, had earlier confessed to having been a Soviet spy before he came to work for Brothman. None of the Brothman staff, including me, knew his background. There were 2 witnesses against Brothman. The first, Elizabeth Bentley, a Soviet spy courier, also known to the government to be a repetitive perjurer, and Harry Gold. And Gold was the only witness against me. Brothman had known Bentley in the early 40s as an assistant to a salesperson, Jacob Golis, who represented himself as having had connections to the Soviet Purchasing Commission, known as Amtorg. And for a fee, he might be able to sell some of Brothman's services to them. For his part, Brothman knew that after the war, and this was in the early 40s, after the war, the USSR would have to rebuild its chemical industry, and he hoped to gain some part of that business. When Golis was not available for a meeting with Brothman to pick up material that Brothman would want to show him, he sent Bentley. She was replaced by Harry Gold. Gold had not yet been sentenced when he testified against me, and he was facing the death penalty. The prosecution endowed our case with overtones of Soviet espionage, although it never produced a shred of evidence. But the prosecution's powerful pretrial publicity convicted us even before we set foot in a courtroom. So in a trial lasting 8 days, the jury found us guilty as charged, and we were each sentenced to the maximum, 2 years in prison and a $10,000 fine for each of us. On a substantive count, Rothman was sentenced to an additional 5 years, but the appeals court overturned that substantive account. So he did the 2 years and paid the $10,000 fine also. When I was released from prison, I was subjected to FBI harassment, suffered job loss, was a social outcast, and I endured the exclusion from certain privileges of citizenship for being a convicted felon. And it took me almost 20 years to pay off that fine. I could never forget I was a convicted felon. On August 12, 2014, last year, a legal team from Baker Botts Esquires filed a petition in my behalf to overturn my conviction of so long ago. On December 4th, last year, Judge Alvin K. Hellerstein presided over a hearing concerning the petition, and after listening to oral arguments from my lawyer and the government, he denied the petition, partly because the events had occurred so long ago and I should have brought the action before.
Oh.
And mostly because the judge felt the relief sought should be reserved for highly special cases. The objections that he raised ignored the fact that had I known I could have sought relief, it would have required a bit of money to pay legal fees. As it was, I was able, luckily, to have a friend who was a lawyer instigate the action. So I lost the petition. Harry Gold was facing the death penalty when he testified at my trial. I believe judges know that when prosecutors prepare a witness to testify, they rehearse them very carefully. And so I think Harry Gold was rehearsed very carefully. He was facing the death penalty. When my conviction was established, he was sentenced to 30 years. It was later cut to 15 when one of my prosecutors interceded on his behalf. Now, 15 is not nothing in prison, but it is not the death penalty. 64 years after an ugly, repressive event occurred, and in the very late years of my life, and I have to tell you that I was 34 in 1960, in 1950, so I'm going to be 99 in the next 10 days.
Whoa.
My wish to set the record straight has become an obligation to history. I may be one of the last of the McCarthy-era victims still alive, but I feel a special responsibility to those whose stories during that repression have never been heard. And I have to stop here a moment and tell you that the two witnesses against Rothman, Elizabeth Bentley, Harry Gold, who was also a witness against me, became unimpeachable witnesses with our conviction They went on to testify as the second and third most important witnesses against the Rosenbergs. This has to tell you something about the Rosenberg case, because it was the same judge, the same prosecution team who performed in that case, and there were questions afterwards that were never answered. It is my fervent hope that political repression will never again cause an ugly blot on this otherwise proud history of the United States. But I want to read you how the jury was selected in my case. It was selected November 10th, 1950, and during voir dire, the court asked, has any juror such prejudice or bias against the House Un-American Committee that would be so influence his judgment so that he or she would not be able to arrive at a just and honest verdict? Have you formed or expressed any opinion concerning the work of that committee of Congress? It's incredible. One prospective juror, Schultz, replied, I have felt for years that they were chasing red herrings, and recently I've been wondering whether I was right, and that made my original judgment correct. Guess what happened? Judge Kaufman promptly dismissed Joe Schultz from the panel. He never served as a juror in my case. The court went on to ask, has any member of the jury indicated support of the Communist Party or election or otherwise, including the signature of any petition or resolution? Has any member of the jury, or did any member of the jury ever sign a petition of the Communist Party to nominate or elect Benjamin J. Davis for public office? You have to wonder. The Communist Party was a legal entity. What instigated this, and why was it never challenged that he was going to eliminate people who had found favor with the Communist Party? You could ask, why not the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? Of course, they are in a very separate category. But this was so illegal, and it was allowed. And it was allowed because people like you sat back and were frightened to death to voice any objection. And because of that, the execution went on of the Rosenbergs. The government knew Ethel was innocent. Her sister-in-law had testified before the grand jury that was investigating espionage before their trial. And she said that she had brought back information from David, her husband, in written form, and she turned it over to Julius Rosenberg. On the witness stand in the trial against the Rosenbergs, she said, Ethel typed those notes. I don't have anything more to say to you except that the Rosenberg case takes precedence over my case. I was unjustly convicted. I had a load of problems after I was freed, but I was free and I was alive. The Rosenbergs were executed, or rather, the Rosenbergs were assassinated. The history books must record the truth, and it is you who are younger who must see to it that that has to happen.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have very little time. This was a very great panel. Let me ask,
Why don't we see if we can take 10 minutes more?
can we take 10 minutes more? Can we ask them out there? But the bottom